When I was an undergraduate at Sydney University, Alan Chalmers had a course called What is this thing called science, which was, and still is, a famous course, which had the very rough shape of the book Theory and Reality. And I took that course. This was during the 1980s, and it was right in the middle of some of the most, it was in the middle of the first round of some intense debates about the nature of science, the authority of science. Radical views of the kind seen in Feyerabend and to some extent in Kuhn were very popular. We hadn't yet got to the time of the really intense science wars of the 1990s, but that was the beginning. Then when I went to Stanford University for my first job after the PhD, it seemed a natural thing to teach a course that had this kind of chronological shape to it, that began roughly at the turn of the 20th century, logical positivism, early empiricist, well not early, but early 20th century empiricist ideas, onwards through the development of the ideas of Popper, into then the beginning of the more radical period and the science wars themselves. I was teaching that course in the 1990s, which was really the peak of the science wars, at least in American universities. And after a few years of teaching the course, it just seemed natural to turn the course into a book. And the first edition of the book was quite close to the lectures that I gave at Stanford all through the 1990s. And the new edition is intended just to be an updating, a reflection of the fact that a lot has happened since then, and I wanted the centre of gravity of the book to be a little further forward in time. It's firstly for students and secondly for interested lay people. As the writing process went along with both the first and the second editions, I found myself continually thinking about which aspects of the book were supposed to make particular sense to students who were sort of walking through a course in this area, and which parts I hoped would make broader contact with the reading public and tell the story of the development of ideas about the nature of science during this period, especially from the early 20th century through to the present day, but looking a bit more broadly and thinking about the relationship between active scientific work and the philosophical work that runs alongside it, commentates on it, tries to understand it, and sometimes contributes to it as well. Not very much. I have a kind of backwards education. When I was an undergraduate student at Sydney University, it was possible to do huge amounts of philosophy because of a quirk in the way the university was set up. There were two philosophy departments that were rivals, and no one talked to each other across the two departments. There was a lot of animosity. But one consequence of that was the fact that I could just do both sequences in the two departments. So in my undergraduate years, I was obsessed with philosophy. I did philosophy pretty much all day, every day. But towards the end of that degree, began to realize, firstly, that I was not educated as well as I should be in science, and secondly, that the views within philosophy that I'd reached were views that emphasized the contact and the continuity between philosophical and scientific work. So then when I went to do a PhD, which was at the University of California, San Diego, I began taking science courses then. When the other students were doing advanced philosophy, I was doing less advanced science. I went to a lot of biology courses, learned most of the biology I know there, tried to pick up a bit more mathematics at that time, and it was an unusual structure because I was coming to these fairly in some ways, basic elementary scientific courses with a mind that was just packed full of philosophy, that had, a huge amount of philosophy going on in there for good or ill. So it was an unusual way to encounter the science after doing so much philosophy. If the question at hand is how scientific knowledge works, then I certainly think that a broader range of people with a broader range of trainings will have something to say. The fundamental epistemology here, the nature of knowledge itself, the nature of evidence, the relationship between the individual efforts of a person trying to understand the world and the community around them, whether that be a scientific community or some other kind of community, all those things are so important, in some ways so poorly understood. I think problems around evidence really are a very open area in the philosophy of science. There's a lot that can be done, I think, that has to be done, just thinking about the fundamental epistemology that bears on the situation. Now, as one gets further into the details of particular scientific disciplines, if one's really interested in the physics of space-time and how Einstein made his way to the revolutionary ideas that he developed and what kind of status those ideas have, then I do think it's inevitable that you have to have a fair bit of scientific training to just to sort of find your feet in that area. I don't think it should be a kind of complete free-for-all. But among philosophers of science, I probably tend a bit more on the side of the group who welcome a diverse range of perspectives in trying to understand not just knowledge in general, but how science itself works. I think that the kind of work that was done in the late 20th century on the sociology of science, trying to understand scientific communities from a sociological point of view, that does go back to the mid-20th century, but it had a kind of heroic period in the late 20th century. I think that work was very interesting and very valuable. It was occasionally met with resistance from scientists who thought that you people are not insiders in a way that enables you to understand what's going on. I don't agree with that perspective. I think the outsider's perspective, the novel points of view that sociologists were able to bring to bear, that different kinds of policy people have been able to bring to bear more recently, I do think of that stuff as valuable. So I'm on the side of the more inclusive point of view in that area. I don't think it's necessary, and more strongly, I don't think it should be a top priority for people in the sciences to understand the philosophy of science. To give you a sense of the possible relationships here, a view that I don't completely agree with, but I think is quite rich and interesting here, was the view of Thomas Kuhn. Thomas Kuhn thought that most of the time science proceeds according to normal science, this very orderly process. He thought that if normal science doesn't run efficiently, with a lot of cooperation, a lot of building on the work of others, then science itself doesn't work very well. And he also thought that philosophy was in some ways the enemy of normal science. The philosopher is always stepping back and asking, well, do we really know this? Might there be possibilities that we aren't thinking about that have been pushed aside too quickly? What's the nature of our authority and our confidence in this area? Thomas Kuhn thought that the last thing you want in normal science of his kind is people asking those questions, because a certain kind of machine has to be in place. And according to Kuhn, it's in the breakdowns, the crises, the periods leading to revolutions, that philosophy suddenly looks relevant to science in a way that it doesn't normally. Now, I think that view is too stylized. It's too extreme. I don't think that most scientists behave as somewhat mechanistic, normal scientists in the way that Thomas Kuhn thought, with a very kind of a somewhat closed-minded outlook. I don't think that's typical in science. But I take the point that there are somewhat different mindsets and intellectual styles that are associated with day-to-day science, even very creative science, and philosophical work, when you do need to be able to continually step back and ask questions afresh, consider possibilities that might have been pushed aside, consider them again. So I think that there's a lot to be said for just the integrity of a person's intellectual life, that they are interested both in scientific ways of looking at the world and also in the philosophy of science. I think it's a good thing to be interested in both, but I resist the idea that it's an essential part of the scientist's toolkit. I think of it as a somewhat optional thing. This is related to the kind of converse, or a complementary question. People sometimes criticize philosophy of science and philosophy more broadly by saying that they think it hasn't contributed very much to scientific progress. And my first response to comments of that kind is to say that it's not the goal of philosophy to contribute to other fields. Philosophy has its own goals. It's a way of looking at things. It's a kind of understanding, very broad and synoptic, that has its own integrity, its own role within intellectual life. Occasionally it does help the sciences. I think there's an interesting list of cases where there was a positive contribution. But I don't think that's the heart of philosophy's mission or its function. I think of it as more of a field of its own. Okay, that's a great example for us to talk about here. That really is, in some ways, the perfect example in the following sense. My book is written about science, and mostly, occasionally it mostly does not tell scientists what to do. But you're quite right that my skeptical attitude to Occam's razor has a bit of that flavour. Here I am trying to get people to think a little bit differently in their day-to-day work as a consequence of reflection of a philosophical kind. Right, so let's talk about Occam's razor. The thing that bothers me most about Occam's razor is that people often say that we should believe the simplest theory that's compatible with the data, we should prefer simple theories and so on. They say that in a way that is intended to involve a normal kind of commitment to the theory, to the ideas. This is what we should believe, this is what we should think. In the absence of any reason at all to think that nature should be simple rather than complex, in the absence of any kind of justification of that kind for the preference. Now, there can be a justification for a preference for simplicity based on more practical things. There are practical reasons to work with simpler theories when you can, and it might also be part of a good sort of rule of motion in science to start simple and expect to get pushed towards more complicated ideas rather than starting with more complicated ideas. I think starting simple is sensible. But those sorts of justifications for simplicity don't involve any kind of commitment to the idea that simpler theories are more likely to be true and that they should be preferred for that reason. And I see all the time, all over. I mean, I'm not a neuroscientist, but I do follow some parts of neuroscience as well as I can, and a lot of my friends are neuroscientists, and you certainly see a lot of Occam's razor appeals there. And I think that there's no general justification for them when they're intended as claims about what we should think is true. I think it's a bit of a holdover from an earlier theological conception of nature. I mean, if there was a God who created the world, it would make sense that he would favor a kind of order and elegance that might be reflected in the simplicity of theories. That's understandable. But once God's out of the picture, you need a new story about why the world ought to be simple rather than complex, why in a comparison between simple and complex you should go one way or the other. And I've just come to think that there is no general justification. There are these practical things which I take seriously, and there are some things that look a bit Occamist that come up in the context of some theories of evidence, the Bayesian model of belief change. But they have a secondary role there. And the kind of ambitious Occamist principles that you see invoked, where a scientist will say, look, my theory is better than this person's theory because my theory is clearly more parsimonious, it's clearly simpler. I just don't see a reason why that's a good rule. And right, and as you say, that is an example of me trying to unseat some fairly deep habits that people have. I think the growth of modelling and simulation has been a very powerful thing. I think it's remarkable what kinds of problems can be assessed now straightforwardly that would have been nightmarishly difficult in the ages before computers and even before modern computers. So I think of this as a good thing. I do think that there are ways of thinking about what models tell us, what they give us, that can occasionally be naive. I think it's necessary to think about what kind of thing a model is. This is a somewhat unusual part of my picture, but I think basically what we're doing with models is trying to understand imaginary systems that are simplified relatives of the empirical, concrete, physical world. So climate models, for example, make a lot of simplifying assumptions. And the fact that they do this, the fact that there's a kind of imaginary element there, doesn't take away from their power. This is not a critical point. It only becomes a critical point when we forget that in order to develop tractable models, we do have to simplify. We do have to pretend things are somewhat simpler than they are. We know that when we're making the model, and we need to know it as well when we bring the model out into policy discussions and into review articles and summaries of what we know. So I think it's natural, given the extraordinary power of computers for computer modelling and simulation, to just continue to become an enormously important thing. Something I discuss at the very end of the book is the future of animal experimentation. I mean, I would like to see less invasive experimentation on animals in the biomedical sciences than there currently is. And I'm glad of the power of simulation-based approaches, for that reason and others. It will make it possible to have that kind of reduction, I think, in the future. Well, the story involves a certain amount of luck and serendipity. I began to just spend more time when I was working in the USA, but coming back to Australia in the northern summers, I began to spend more time in the water, and happened to be doing that in a marine reserve, quite a recently declared marine reserve, hasn't been around for very long, which has become this extraordinary place full of fish, full of cephalopods, has some turtles, quite close to Sydney, but really just a remarkably rich place. It's called Cabbage Tree Bay, and came across the cephalopods, the giant cuttlefish first, and then octopuses once I'd become interested in them. And I had never before these experiences been that interested in animals, and in particular animals. It feels a bit odd now because I was always interested in evolution and always interested in the mind, and the evolution of the mind is a very interesting area. And I'd written about it, but not in a way that focused on some particular group of animals as important. And I realized that cephalopods are very important because their behaviors are so complex, their nervous systems are complex, but they're so far from us in evolutionary terms. It's such a deep evolutionary branching you have to go back to get to a common ancestor that links us to them. So they came to seem important animals philosophically for that reason. If I hadn't begun spending that time in the water in this very particular place, I don't think a lot of this would have happened. I was really led there. I was led there by those experiences. And now that it's some years on, I have come to think that it is important to understand the variety of animals, the different kinds of experiences they have, for a variety of, for a wide range of reasons. One reason being, one of the basic questions in philosophy and also in science, and especially in neuroscience, is what kind of place subjective experience has in the biological world, how it arises, what kinds of animals have it, what kind of brain structures are important in giving rise to it. And one of the things that's happened over the last 10 or 15 years is all sorts of animals that I think were not taken particularly seriously as shedding light on these questions. Animals like hermit crabs, for example. Here I'm thinking of Robert Elwood's work on hermit crabs. There's all sorts of animals that didn't seem important before that have become important. And the kind of importance they have involves what they tell us about the place that mind and experience in particular has within the world, where it's found, what kind of phenomenon it is. And I think the more animals that we can understand from that point of view, I think the more we'll learn about what kind of place mind has in the natural world.
Thank you very much, Peter Godfrey Smith. I think we've reached, the time we had for this interview. Again, I want to thank you for being with us, and I hope to see you in Padua in person next year.
That would be great. Thanks. I enjoyed this.
Thank you.